Psychic children, extraordinary minds or extraordinary myths? Part 1. Children who seem to know the impossible. There is something uniquely unsettling about a child who knows something they should not know. A toddler who accurately describes a place they have never visited. A young child who insists they spoke with a deceased grandparent. A little girl who tells her parents that someone will call in 5 minutes, and moments later, the telephone rings. A boy who wakes from a dream describing an event that appears on the evening news the following day. Stories like these have been shared for centuries. Parents whisper about them. Grandparents pass them down through generations. Teachers occasionally encounter them in classrooms. Psychologists sometimes hear them during interviews. And researchers interested in consciousness have collected thousands of such accounts from around the world. Some people believe these children possess psychic abilities that gradually fade with age. Others argue that children simply have vivid imaginations, remarkable memories, and a natural talent for noticing patterns adults often overlook. Between these two viewpoints lies one of the most fascinating mysteries in the study of consciousness. Why do so many cultures tell remarkably similar stories about unusually perceptive children? Across continents and centuries, accounts appear with surprising consistency. Children who claim to remember previous lives. Children who seem able to predict future events. Children who describe invisible friends who appear unusually detailed and consistent. Children who sense danger before it occurs. Children who insist they can see people no one else can see. Are these stories evidence of abilities science has yet to understand? Or do they reveal something equally fascinating about childhood development and the human imagination? The debate is far older than modern psychology. Ancient civilizations often viewed children as naturally closer to the spiritual world. Because they had only recently entered earthly life, many believed they remained connected to realities adults could no longer perceive. In some traditions, young children were considered especially receptive to dreams, visions, and messages from ancestors. As they matured, everyday responsibilities were thought to gradually close that doorway. Today, modern neuroscience offers a very different perspective. The brains of young children develop rapidly during the first years of life. Imagination, memory, perception, and emotional processing function differently than they do in adults. Children often blur the boundaries between fantasy and reality, not because they are irrational, but because their understanding of the world is still forming. This developmental flexibility allows for extraordinary creativity. It may also contribute to experiences that adults interpret as psychic. Yet certain cases continue to puzzle both believers and skeptics alike. Some children have accurately described hidden objects. Others have reported information later verified by adults. A few have become the subjects of scientific investigation. Most remain unexplained, not because they necessarily prove psychic ability, but because no single explanation accounts for every reported case. This is not a story about proving that children possess supernatural powers. Nor is it a story about dismissing unusual experiences as mere fantasy. Instead, it is an exploration of one of humanity's oldest questions. Do children sometimes perceive more than adults realize? Or are we witnessing the remarkable capabilities of developing minds learning to make sense of an endlessly complex world? To understand how these ideas emerged, we must first look back through history. Because long before psychologists studied childhood, ancient cultures believed that children could see far beyond the visible world. Part 2. Ancient beliefs, children between two worlds. Long before psychology became a science. Long before neuroscience could study the developing brain. Nearly every civilization held special beliefs about young children. Although these cultures were separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years of history, many arrived at a surprisingly similar idea. Children were thought to exist between two worlds. Not fully part of the spiritual realm. Not yet completely anchored in the physical one. In ancient Egypt, childhood was viewed as a period of innocence and divine protection. Certain children were believed to receive meaningful dreams or symbolic visions from the gods. Priests sometimes interpreted these dreams as messages rather than ordinary imagination. In ancient Greece, philosophers and religious traditions occasionally suggested that the soul possessed knowledge before birth. While the philosopher Plato did not describe psychic children in the modern sense, his concept of anamnesis proposed that learning could be a form of remembering truths the soul already knew before entering the physical world. Across many Hindu traditions, the belief in reincarnation gave rise to stories of young children recalling previous lives. Some children reportedly described families, villages, occupations, or events that they could not reasonably have learned through ordinary experience. These accounts have continued into modern times and have become the subject of scientific investigation. In Buddhist cultures, especially within Tibetan traditions, children displaying unusual wisdom or memories have sometimes been regarded as possible reincarnations of respected spiritual teachers. Formal recognition involves careful investigation and should not be confused with casual claims, but the underlying belief reflects the idea that consciousness may continue beyond a single lifetime. Many indigenous cultures around the world have also viewed children as possessing heightened sensitivity. Among numerous Native American traditions, Aboriginal Australian communities, and other indigenous peoples, children were often encouraged to pay attention to dreams, intuition, and experiences in nature. Elders sometimes believed that young minds could perceive signs and connections that adults, burdened by daily concerns, might overlook. Throughout medieval Europe, beliefs took a very different turn. Unusual children could be viewed with both fascination and fear. A child claiming to see invisible beings might be regarded as blessed in one village and deeply misunderstood in another. Some families interpreted such experiences as divine gifts. Others worried they reflected illness, misfortune, or supernatural influence. As scientific thinking expanded during the Enlightenment, explanations began to change. Rather than asking whether children communicated with spirits or remembered previous lives, scholars increasingly focused on imagination, education, memory, and development. The supernatural explanations that had dominated earlier centuries gradually gave way to psychological ones. Yet the stories never disappeared. Parents continued to report children speaking about people they had never met. Children described unfamiliar places with surprising confidence. Some insisted they remembered another home. Others spoke calmly about relatives who had died before they themselves were born. Many of these stories faded as the children grew older. Some were forgotten entirely. Others remained so vivid that families preserved them for decades. By the 20th century, researchers from several disciplines began asking whether these accounts could be studied systematically. Instead of relying only on folklore or family traditions, they sought documentation. Interviews, medical records, birth certificates, historical archives, independent witnesses. One question guided much of this work. If children truly reported extraordinary experiences, could those reports be investigated using the same careful methods applied to other scientific questions? The search for answers would eventually lead to one of the largest collections of unusual childhood cases ever assembled. And at the center of that effort was a psychiatrist whose work would become known around the world. His name was Dr. Ian Stevenson. Part 3: Dr. Ian Stevenson and the Children Who Remembered Previous Lives. In the 1960s, a Canadian-born psychiatrist began investigating a question that most scientists avoided. Could some young children genuinely remember events from another life? His name was Dr. Ian Stevenson. As chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, Stevenson was already an accomplished physician and researcher. Unlike many people who explored paranormal topics, he approached the subject cautiously. He was not trying to prove reincarnation. He was trying to investigate unusual claims using careful documentation. Stevenson noticed a recurring pattern. Around the world, families occasionally reported children, usually between the ages of 2 and 6, who began speaking spontaneously about another life. These children often made their statements without prompting. Some insisted that their current parents were not their real family. Others claimed they had lived in another town. Some described occupations they could not reasonably have known about. A few even spoke about the circumstances surrounding an alleged previous death. Most remarkable of all, many of these memories reportedly faded by the time the child reached 7 or 8 years old. Rather than dismissing these reports outright, Stevenson decided to investigate them before the memories disappeared. Over the next 4 decades, he and his colleagues traveled extensively through Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. They documented more than 2,500 individual cases, making this one of the largest collections of its kind ever assembled. His method was deliberately systematic. Whenever possible, Stevenson interviewed the child before any alleged previous family had been contacted. He recorded the child's statements in detail. Names, locations, occupations, descriptions of homes, family relationships, personal possessions, causes of death. Only afterward would investigators attempt to determine whether a deceased individual matching those descriptions had actually existed. In some cases, they found no convincing match. In others, similarities appeared striking. Several children reportedly recognized relatives from the deceased person's family. Some identified houses they had never visited. Others pointed out hidden objects or described events that surviving family members claimed had not been publicly known. These cases attracted worldwide attention. They also generated considerable controversy. Supporters argued that the number of detailed correspondences exceeded what would reasonably be expected by coincidence. Critics suggested more conventional explanations. Information might have been acquired unintentionally through conversations. Families could have influenced the children's memories without realizing it. Investigators themselves might have been affected by confirmation bias. Cultural expectations also played an important role. Many of Stevenson's strongest cases came from countries where belief in reincarnation was already widespread. Skeptics argued that children raised in such environments might naturally interpret dreams, imagination, or overheard information through the lens of previous lives. Stevenson acknowledged these concerns. He did not claim that every case supported reincarnation. Instead, he argued that a small number remained difficult to explain using ordinary psychological or environmental factors alone. One aspect of his research attracted particular attention. Some children were born with unusual birthmarks or birth defects. In a number of cases, Stevenson compared these physical features with medical records from the deceased individuals the children claimed to remember. He reported instances in which birthmarks appeared to correspond roughly with fatal wounds described in autopsy reports. This became one of the most debated parts of his work. Supporters considered it among the strongest evidence that consciousness might somehow survive death. Critics argued that birthmarks are common, interpretations can be subjective, and such comparisons require extraordinary caution. Importantly, Stevenson's research has never been accepted as definitive proof of reincarnation by the broader scientific community. However, many scholars acknowledge that his investigations were unusually thorough for such an unconventional subject. Even researchers who disagree with his conclusions often recognize the care with which he documented interviews, gathered witness testimony, and preserved original records. Today, his work continues through the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. Researchers there investigate questions surrounding consciousness, near-death experiences, and children's reports of unusual memories using modern research methods. Whether one views these cases as evidence of reincarnation, extraordinary memory, cultural influence, or an as-yet unknown psychological process, they remain among the most intriguing studies ever conducted on the experiences of young children. But memories of previous lives are only one category of extraordinary childhood reports. Many parents describe something different. Children who seem to know what is about to happen before it happens. Part 4: Premonitions, Intuition, and Children who Predict the Future. Imagine sitting at the breakfast table when your 5-year-old suddenly says, "Don't let Dad take that road today." There is no explanation. No obvious reason. Just a quiet statement made with complete certainty. Hours later, traffic reports reveal a serious accident on that very route. Stories like this have been shared by families around the world for generations. Sometimes they involve dreams. Sometimes they are simple comments made in passing. Occasionally, they appear so specific that those who witness them remember the moment for the rest of their lives. Do these experiences demonstrate genuine precognition? Or are they examples of coincidence combined with the remarkable way human memory works? The question has fascinated psychologists, parapsychologists, and philosophers for decades. Children often surprise adults with unexpected observations. Because they are naturally curious and less constrained by assumptions, they sometimes notice details that others overlook. A child may sense tension between adults long before anyone speaks openly about a problem. They may predict that someone will call because they unconsciously recognize subtle daily patterns. In many cases, what appears psychic may actually reflect exceptionally keen observation. Yet some accounts seem more difficult to explain. Parents occasionally report children describing events before anyone could reasonably have known about them. A child dreams that a relative is coming home unexpectedly. The next morning, the relative arrives without prior notice. Another child repeatedly insists that a family pet is going away. Within days, the animal dies from an illness that had shown few outward signs. These experiences are emotionally powerful. Precisely because they are meaningful, they are often remembered vividly. Psychologists point out, however, that memory is selective. People tend to remember the dreams and predictions that appear to come true while forgetting the many that do not. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias. If a child has dozens of dreams each month, only the occasional match with later events may stand out, giving the impression of extraordinary accuracy. Another factor is probability. Children make countless spontaneous statements every day. Most are forgotten almost immediately. But when one unexpectedly aligns with a later event, it naturally attracts attention. Our brains are highly skilled at detecting meaningful patterns, sometimes even where none actually exist. Despite these well-established psychological explanations, researchers have continued to investigate claims of precognition under controlled conditions. Beginning in the 20th century, several laboratories explored whether people, including children in some studies, could anticipate randomly generated events at rates slightly greater than chance. Results have been mixed. Some experiments have reported small statistical effects. Others have found no evidence beyond ordinary probability. To date, there is no broad scientific consensus that precognition has been demonstrated reliably under controlled laboratory conditions. Many scientists conclude that the evidence remains inconclusive. Supporters argue that subtle effects may exist but are difficult to reproduce consistently. Another intriguing possibility involves intuition rather than prediction. The human brain continuously processes information outside conscious awareness. Tiny changes in facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, environmental cues. Children may be especially sensitive to these signals because they rely heavily on observation while learning about the world. A child who appears to predict an argument between parents may actually be detecting emotional tension long before adults consciously acknowledge it. Similarly, a child may sense that a grandparent is becoming seriously ill by noticing subtle physical changes that others overlook. This kind of unconscious perception is well documented in psychology. It requires no supernatural explanation. Yet it can sometimes feel almost psychic to those experiencing it. For families who report truly unusual experiences, however, conventional explanations do not always seem sufficient. Some accounts remain deeply puzzling. Dreams that contain unexpected details. Statements verified months later. Knowledge that appears difficult to trace to ordinary sources. Whether these represent coincidence, exceptional intuition, or something science has yet to fully understand remains an open question. Perhaps the most common reports, however, involve neither predictions nor memories. Instead, they concern companions whom only the child can see. Invisible friends. To many parents, they are a perfectly normal part of childhood. To others, they seem to possess a life of their own. Part 5, Invisible Friends, Imagination or Something More? Few childhood experiences are as common, or as mysterious, as the invisible friend. A young child sets an extra place at the dinner table. They leave room in the car for someone no one else can see. They insist that a visitor is standing in the corner of the bedroom. Sometimes they laugh with this unseen companion. Sometimes they argue. Sometimes they quietly listen, as though someone is speaking back. For most parents, these imaginary companions are considered a normal part of childhood. Developmental psychologists estimate that a significant percentage of children create imaginary friends at some point, particularly between the ages of 3 and 7. These companions often appear during periods of rapid emotional and cognitive development. They can help children practice social skills, work through fears, solve problems, and express feelings that may be difficult to communicate directly. From a psychological perspective, imaginary friends are generally viewed as healthy. Research has shown that children with imaginary companions are not more likely to develop mental illness than other children. In fact, many studies suggest they often display strong creativity, language development, empathy, and emotional intelligence. Yet not every account fits neatly into this explanation. Some parents describe experiences that seem unusually detailed. The child consistently describes the same individual over many months or even years. The unseen companion has a name, an age, distinctive clothing, specific habits, sometimes even a personal history. Occasionally, children claim their invisible friend is someone who once lived. A grandparent who died before the child was born. A sibling lost before birth. A neighbor the child never met. In certain cases, families later discover that some of the child's descriptions resemble real individuals. Whether these similarities result from coincidence, subtle information acquired unknowingly, or something more unusual remains difficult to determine. Researchers approach these reports with caution. Children are highly imaginative. They absorb enormous amounts of information from conversations, television, books, photographs, and observations that adults may not realize they have noticed. Pieces of this information can later be woven into imaginative stories that feel entirely real to the child. At the same time, children's experiences are often emotionally genuine. Even if an invisible companion exists only within the child's imagination, the comfort, friendship, or reassurance it provides is very real. This distinction is important. Imaginary does not necessarily mean meaningless. Many psychologists encourage parents to respond calmly rather than dismissively. Instead of insisting, "That's not real," they may ask, "Tell me about your friend." This approach respects the child's experience without reinforcing extraordinary claims that cannot be verified. Some paranormal investigators interpret certain cases differently. They suggest that a small number of children may be unusually sensitive to experiences adults no longer perceive. According to this view, children might occasionally describe deceased relatives, spiritual beings, or other forms of consciousness. These interpretations remain speculative and are not supported by scientific consensus. Nevertheless, they continue to be discussed in books, documentaries, and spiritual traditions around the world. One interesting observation appears repeatedly across cultures. As children grow older, invisible friends often disappear. Whether understood as imagination or something more mysterious, the experiences usually fade between the ages of 6 and 8. School, social development, logical reasoning, and changing brain development gradually reshape how children interpret the world around them. For many families, the invisible companion quietly vanishes without explanation. Years later, the child may barely remember the experience. Others recall it vividly, describing it as one of the most meaningful parts of their early childhood. Whatever their origin, invisible friends remind us that the boundary between imagination and perception is far more complex than it first appears. But some children report experiences that extend beyond unseen companions. They describe seeing people who have already died. These stories have been reported across cultures for centuries and remain among the most emotionally powerful accounts in the study of so-called psychic children. Part 6: Children Who See Spirits, Encounters with the Unseen. One of the most emotionally powerful stories a parent can hear is also one of the most difficult to explain. A child looks toward an empty chair and quietly says, "Grandma is here." The family freezes. Grandmother passed away months ago. the child never seems frightened. Instead, they smile, wave, or begin carrying on what appears to be an ordinary conversation. For families who experience moments like these, the memory often lasts a lifetime. Reports of children seeing deceased relatives or unknown figures appear in cultures across the world. Despite differences in religion and tradition, many accounts share remarkably similar features. The child is usually very young. The experience often occurs between the ages of 2 and 6. The child appears calm rather than afraid. And the experiences tend to become less frequent as the child grows older. Some children describe grandparents they never met. Others speak about siblings who died before they were born. A few report seeing people dressed in clothing from another era. Some simply refer to the nice lady or the old man who visits their room. Most parents respond in one of 3 ways. Some accept the experience as genuine spiritual communication. Others assume the child is imagining things. Many remain uncertain, choosing neither belief nor disbelief. From a psychological perspective, there are several possible explanations. Young children possess exceptionally vivid imaginations. The boundaries between dreams, memories, fantasy, and waking experience are often less distinct than they are for adults. A child may awaken from a realistic dream and briefly experience it as if it were continuing into the waking world. Developmental psychologists also note that children frequently engage in symbolic thinking. An unseen figure may represent comfort during periods of stress, loneliness, or emotional change. The experience can feel entirely real without requiring an external supernatural cause. Neuroscience offers another possibility. During childhood, the brain undergoes rapid development. Sleep patterns differ significantly from those of adults. Young children spend more time in stages of sleep associated with vivid dreaming, and they are more likely to experience phenomena such as hypnopompic or hypnagogic imagery, vivid perceptions that occur while waking up or falling asleep. These experiences can involve seeing people, hearing voices, or sensing a presence, even though no external stimulus is present. For the child, the experience is genuine. The brain is simply processing perception in an unusual state. Yet not every report occurs around sleep. Some happen in broad daylight. Some involve multiple conversations over weeks or months. Occasionally, children describe details that surprise adults. A little boy identifies an old photograph of a great-grandfather he had supposedly never seen. A young girl speaks about a family friend who passed away before she was born. Cases like these naturally invite questions. Could the child have overheard conversations without anyone realizing it? Did subtle cues influence their responses? Or is there another explanation that has yet to be understood? Researchers emphasize the importance of careful investigation. Children are highly suggestible. Leading questions can unintentionally shape memories. If adults repeatedly ask, "Was it Grandma?" or "What did the angel tell you?" the child's story may gradually change to fit those expectations. For this reason, psychologists encourage neutral questioning and careful documentation whenever unusual reports occur. Many spiritual traditions interpret these experiences differently. In Christianity, some believe children may occasionally perceive angels or receive divine comfort. In various indigenous traditions, children are sometimes regarded as naturally sensitive to ancestors or the spirit world. Certain Eastern philosophies suggest that young minds remain more open to forms of consciousness that adults have learned to ignore. These beliefs vary widely and should not be viewed as established scientific conclusions. What is striking is how similar many family stories remain despite enormous cultural differences. Parents from different countries often describe nearly identical experiences, even when their religious beliefs are completely different. Whether these similarities reflect universal aspects of child development or something more mysterious remains unknown. Most importantly, experts advise that such experiences should always be considered within the child's overall well-being. If a child appears healthy, happy, and unafraid, occasional reports of unusual perceptions are generally not considered a cause for alarm. However, persistent distress, frightening visions, or experiences that interfere with daily life should always be discussed with qualified healthcare professionals to rule out medical or psychological conditions. The goal is neither to dismiss a child's experiences nor to immediately interpret them as supernatural. It is to listen carefully, respond compassionately, and remain open to evidence. For every story that seems extraordinary, there are many that find ordinary explanations. And yet, some stories continue to resist easy answers. Perhaps the most intriguing are those in which children appear to know information that no one believes they could have learned. These cases have challenged researchers for decades and remain among the most debated in the study of consciousness. Part 7: Remarkable Cases, Children Who Knew Too Much. Throughout history, certain stories have stood apart from the countless tales of vivid imagination and childhood fantasy. These are the cases that investigators have spent years attempting to explain. Not because they prove psychic ability, but because they contain details that appear unusually difficult to account for through ordinary means. One widely discussed category involves children who seem to recognize people they have never met. A toddler points to an old family photograph and identifies an individual who died decades earlier. A young girl correctly names distant relatives she has supposedly never encountered. A child describes the layout of a house they have never visited. Individually, such events might be dismissed as coincidence. Taken together, they have inspired decades of investigation. Researchers approach these reports cautiously. Human memory is remarkably flexible. Families often reconstruct stories over time. Small details become sharper. Coincidences become more meaningful. Conversations that occurred after an event may gradually be remembered as having happened before it. This process, known as memory reconstruction, is well documented in psychology. It reminds us that sincere witnesses are not necessarily perfect witnesses. Another group of reports involves hidden objects. A child insists that an old watch is buried beneath a loose floorboard. An elderly relative checks. The watch is there. Stories like these have circulated for generations. Unfortunately, many survive only as family anecdotes, making independent verification impossible. Researchers generally place greater weight on cases documented before the outcome became known. Perhaps the most famous investigations involve children who provided names, addresses, occupations, or family histories that investigators later attempted to verify. Some of these became part of Dr. Ian Stevenson's extensive research. Others were investigated independently by journalists, psychologists, or historians. In several cases, investigators reported finding deceased individuals whose lives appeared to match many of the child's statements. Supporters view these correspondences as deeply intriguing. Skeptics ask equally important questions. Could information have been obtained unintentionally? Did the family unknowingly influence the child's responses? Were investigators focusing primarily on the successful matches while overlooking the many incorrect details? These questions remain central to evaluating every case. One particularly interesting pattern appears repeatedly. Many children begin making unusual statements around the age of 2 or 3. The memories often become most detailed between ages 3 and 5. Then, quite suddenly, they begin to fade. By the time the child reaches elementary school, the stories frequently disappear altogether. Why this occurs is unknown. Developmental psychologists suggest that as the brain matures, autobiographical memory changes dramatically. Early childhood memories naturally fade in a phenomenon known as childhood amnesia. This process affects all children, regardless of whether their memories involve ordinary events or extraordinary claims. Supporters of reincarnation theories point to the same pattern as evidence that early memories gradually become replaced by the experiences of the current lifetime. Both interpretations acknowledge the same observation. The difference lies in how that observation is explained. Modern investigators have become increasingly careful in documenting unusual cases. Interviews are recorded. Statements are written down before verification begins. Witnesses are interviewed separately. Historical records are examined whenever possible. These procedures cannot guarantee perfect accuracy, but they help reduce many of the problems that affected earlier investigations. Despite these improvements, no single case has achieved universal scientific acceptance as proof of psychic ability, reincarnation, or communication with the deceased. Each case contains unanswered questions. Each has supporters and critics. And each contributes another piece to a puzzle that remains incomplete. Perhaps that is what makes these stories so compelling. They exist in the space between certainty and mystery, between what we know and what we do not yet understand. Today, scientists continue to investigate consciousness using increasingly sophisticated tools: brain imaging, developmental psychology, genetics, artificial intelligence, advanced statistical methods. As our understanding of the human mind grows, some mysteries may eventually find conventional explanations. Others may lead to entirely new discoveries. For now, the experiences of these remarkable children remain among the most fascinating and controversial subjects in the study of human consciousness. The final question, however, is perhaps the most important. What does modern science actually say about psychic children? And where does the evidence leave us today? Part 8. What does science say? Separating evidence from belief. After centuries of stories, decades of investigations, and thousands of reported cases, where does the evidence leave us? The answer is more nuanced than many people expect. Modern science does not simply divide the subject into true or false. Instead, researchers ask several different questions. Did the reported event actually happen? If it did, how reliable is the evidence? Can the result be independently verified? Can it be repeated under controlled conditions? And perhaps most importantly, is there a conventional explanation that accounts for the observations? These questions form the foundation of scientific inquiry. When studying children, they become even more important. Young children are honest far more often than they are deceptive. But honesty is not the same as accuracy. Children experience the world differently from adults. Their memories are still developing. Their imaginations are extraordinarily rich. And they often combine dreams, conversations, emotions, and real experiences into stories that feel completely authentic. This does not mean they are lying. It means their developing brains process reality in unique ways. Developmental psychologists have spent decades studying these processes. They have found that children are highly creative. They readily engage in symbolic thinking. They may assign personalities to toys, hold conversations with imaginary companions, or vividly remember dreams as though they were waking experiences. All of these behaviors are considered normal aspects of healthy development. At the same time, researchers acknowledge that some reported cases remain difficult to explain completely. Not because they necessarily prove psychic abilities, but because they contain details that cannot easily be traced to obvious sources of information. These rare cases continue to attract interest from psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and researchers who study consciousness. The challenge lies in separating extraordinary evidence from ordinary coincidence. Human beings are exceptional pattern seekers. Our brains constantly search for meaning. If enough children make predictions, a few will inevitably appear remarkably accurate. If enough dreams are remembered, some will seem prophetic in hindsight. This does not automatically diminish the emotional impact of those experiences. It simply reminds us to distinguish between meaningful personal experiences and scientific evidence. Memory presents another challenge. Parents naturally remember extraordinary moments. Years later, conversations become simplified. Details shift. Timelines blur. Without written documentation made before events occur, it becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct exactly what happened. This is why contemporary researchers emphasize careful record keeping. Some investigations now include video recordings, written statements, independent witnesses, and blind verification whenever possible. These methods help reduce bias and improve reliability. Another important consideration is culture. Children raised in different societies often interpret unusual experiences according to local beliefs. A child in one country may describe an angel. Another may describe an ancestor. A third may speak of a previous life. The experience itself may feel similar, while the explanation differs according to family traditions and cultural expectations. This observation suggests that beliefs influence how experiences are understood, even if they do not necessarily determine whether an unusual perception occurred. Neuroscience has also transformed our understanding of childhood. Brain imaging reveals that children's brains are constantly reorganizing themselves. Neural connections form and disappear at astonishing rates. Sleep patterns differ from those of adults. Dream activity is especially intense. Imagination, emotion, and memory interact in complex ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. Many experiences once considered mysterious now have plausible neurological explanations. Others remain unresolved. Importantly, no major scientific organization currently recognizes psychic abilities in children as an established fact. The available evidence has not reached the level of consistency and reproducibility required for scientific consensus. That does not mean every reported experience has been explained. It means the evidence remains inconclusive. For many researchers, that distinction matters. Science is not in the business of proving beliefs. Nor is it in the business of dismissing sincere experiences without investigation. Its purpose is to follow evidence wherever it leads. Sometimes that journey confirms extraordinary claims. More often, it uncovers fascinating natural explanations. And occasionally, it leaves important questions unanswered. Perhaps that is the most honest conclusion we can reach today. Psychic children remain an enduring mystery. Not because science has confirmed supernatural abilities, nor because science has completely explained every remarkable case, but because the developing human mind continues to surprise us in ways that challenge both believers and skeptics alike. Whether these stories ultimately reveal hidden capacities of consciousness, extraordinary aspects of childhood psychology, or a combination of both, they remind us that there is still much to learn about the greatest mystery of all: the human mind.